Hello and welcome to this video on eugenics and trait selection. That is a phrase that is unlikely to occur normally in conversation, but nothing is unheard of on the internet. That is exactly what happened with Richard Dawkins recently. Although well known for his strong views and excellent communication of these ideas, Dawkins is also known for his occasional gaffe. And this was just such a situation. As with all ideas being present in some corner of the internet, there will always be someone who misunderstands or misrepresents what someone says. And this again is where Dawkins fell into the traps of the internet. When read as is, Dawkins' statement makes sense. To begin the quote, "It's one thing to deploy eugenics on ideological, political, moral grounds. It's quite another to conclude that it wouldn't work in practice. Of course it would. It works for cows, horses, pigs, dogs, and roses. Why on earth wouldn't it work for humans? Facts ignore ideology." End quote. What is worse is those who deliberately miss the point of this and are ignorant of both the old and recent dark history of developed Western nations, and the stories that we have of how they conducted their own eugenics programs. Countries that should have known better, should have been better, and were not. He summarizes this in a great way to quote, "Deny obvious scientific facts and we lose, or at best derail the argument." End quote. Considering this, Dawkins' tweet should not have been controversial for all the reasons put forward by many. It is the common history and problems that it has caused that should have been controversial. Instead, the tweet was targeted and misrepresented. It seems reasonable to say everyone agrees that people have a right to life, and this largely stems from a moral perspective. That others should not end or deny others that right based on a system of prejudice, power, or similar. This is something that Dawkins clearly defines that he thought, and adds that later to make clear. But any charitable or reasonable reading of his first tweet would also lead to the same conclusion. As he said in another tweet, to automatically assume the morally objectionable would not work is nonsense. To use a daily example of this argument failing, let's consider murder. Murder is, by definition, depriving another of their life through a disparity in power. It's morally objectionable, and yet it occurs. Much like eugenics, there is no reason why it cannot happen. He further adds to that tweet that we've already done this by using agricultural and animal examples. To build on this, let's look at 3 species: dogs, corn, and finally humans with its sordid history. As we all accept, dogs are the domesticated descendants of wolves. The wild wolf is very different to the dog as we know it. At a minimum, there is size, color, and appearance differences, and some similarities. This has been extended to change the behavior and temperament of the dog as a species, which made it more cooperative and beneficial to humans. Taking all that diversity that we have now as granted, we can go back a long ways to see how we both got to this level of diversity, with many different sizes, shapes, and appearances, and how he managed to create dogs as a species. Traits favored by people may or may not be directly beneficial to an animal, such as the pug with its breathing difficulties. But it did not matter, so long as we were using artificial selection. That allowed people to choose which animals would breed and how. That meant they could keep a disadvantageous trait, like damaged backs, hind legs, or noses. it would be passed on to offspring because the pressure on that particular breed was taken away. The theory of artificial selection has always been that choosing individuals with certain traits, like a friendlier attitude, or those who are better at hunting, would allow those characteristics to travel on to the next generation and alter their development, meaning you could entrench a particular trait. For example, we could extend the period for which they are a puppy. This can be seen in Labradors, which are often considered to retain a puppy-like personality for several years. Over time, this would lead to alterations in the genes that would extend this particular trait, or a group of genes in some cases. It could be as simple as 1 or 2 genes associated with the color of a coat, or it could be multiple genes involved with temperament. As you can increase the time frame of certain things, you have more time to work with them. For example, the puppy element of a dog. The longer that lasts, the longer you can train a dog and get it to behave in certain ways more effectively. Of course, this is not all sunshine and roses. Artificial selection has increasingly been responsible for adverse effects. A strong example being the large heads of a bulldog. It generally makes it impossible for the bulldog pups to be delivered via normal means, and must instead be delivered via cesarean. Those dogs which did not carry the desirable traits were generally not bred again, which meant that their genes, traits, and similar would be removed from the species. This is, for all intents and purposes, eugenics. We have similar behavior seen with how we developed corn. It was domesticated through artificial selection, and it's very much like natural selection, but interfered with by humans. For example, the very earliest corn cob was really more like wheat, a relatively small body, very few kernels, and it didn't tend to grow very well. By choosing those corn cobs that had more kernels, larger kernels, and that grew better, meant that those seeds could be planted out again to get a better yield the next year. They could then be planted out again the year after to produce better yields further to the year before, and this process could be repeated infinitely. Of course, it gets to a point where you get diminishing returns, but it allowed us as a species to choose what plants would carry on. As you can tell, this has worked throughout history, from the earliest caveman days right through to modern times. The examples Dawkins gives are no less controversial for the nature of his tweet than they are factually correct. But that is it, they remain correct. It is where humans are involved that it seems to elicit a visceral reaction, and this has occurred with people denying legitimacy of the argument based on a gut feeling, but not the facts. They are either ignorant of our common history, basic science, or just plain ignorant. Let's skip over the earliest horror shows and that of the 1940s, and earlier to examine more recent histories. It would be reasonable to assume that most people are aware of what happened and why, which is compounded by the way YouTube penalizes videos that discuss that period. The modern time frame is one in which those alive now can and possibly may have direct knowledge of eugenics programs if they are from places like the UK, America, or Canada. Both America and Canada have, and to a degree, continue to practice forced sterilization of certain groups. This includes those with disabilities and those in prison. A 2013 report found that female prisoners were being sterilized as part of their sentencing in California. In Canada, this was enshrined in law until the 1970s. That is, less than 50 years ago. They justified this on a series of premises. This included the diminished capacity of those with disabilities, the mental state of the person involved, and the social circumstances like employment, property rights, and similar. That meant those who were mentally limited could be put into an institute where, along with their daily care and lives, they could be medically sterilized. In other cases, adults could be put into similar institutes and sterilized like a prison. Others viewed it as a morally responsible act to reduce the single-parent household figure. It is the last category that is most alarming. Those women who became pregnant as single mothers could be sterilized after giving birth to a child who was adopted out. They were seen as morally corrupt or an unreasonable person who could not make appropriate decisions at the time. The theory was that by doing this, they removed a drain on a system, prevent a disabled person from being unable to care for a child, as the child would not exist, or, as with modern examples, it prevented morally questionable people from passing on their morally questionable genes. Of course, all of this is ignorant and poorly executed. Denying reproductive capacity to women would not remove the gene or trait from society, but it did harm the psyche of these people. The opposite is true and has been true historically. The Potsdam Giants are a well-known example. This was a personal project of the Prussian king Friedrich Wilhelm I. He chose to either employ or kidnap above-average height individuals for his own personal grenadiers regiment. He then tried to breed them with tall women to produce taller children. This regiment ran as a pet project from 1675 to 1740. A common modern example is that of redheads. Red hair is a recessive trait. That means it is not going to show up in children of parents that have passed on one copy of the genes responsible. As fewer redheads exist, the gene becomes less common and fewer children carry two copies. This means fewer children have red hair, if natural forces were at work. However, society views it as a desirable trait due to scarcity, and so more people reproduce and red hair won't go away anytime soon. The same trait applies to the ever-increasing height of children. When well nourished and society is going fairly well, children get taller. This owes to how successful people are generally tall. They have more children as they are successful and can afford to support them. This leads to a general and ever-increasing height in offspring. We are effectively selecting for height in society. These are examples of how eugenics could be at work in society if we were to put a procedural and policy-based approach to it. Something we have seen in China until very recently. They conducted a similar practice under the one-child policy where males were preferred. This led to a significant increase in the male population of China, and we have yet to see the full implications of this selection. But having chosen only one sex, it could be interesting for the whole overall social well-being. As Dawkins put it, a eugenic policy would be bad. I am combating the illogical step from X would be bad to so X is impossible. End quote. We have done it before. We are arguably doing it now, and may do it again in the future. Denying the possibility does not stop the possibility. It just makes it harder to prepare for reality and deal with it. In another way of phrasing that position, facts don't care for your feelings. They remain even if your feelings do not. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it useful, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.